Okay.
Hi, hi, this is Nikki Giamarco, and I'm a librarian with Pima County Public Library. And I'm a member of our Biblio Lotus team, whose mission is to support and value the culture and voice of Asian communities in Pima County by providing resources and programs and by establishing ongoing partnerships with Asian organizations therein. We also like to highlight Asian and Asian American authors and voices. And I'm excited to say that I'm with Crystal Hana Kim, the author of critically acclaimed novels If You Leave Me and The Stone Home, which is her latest novel published last year in 2024. The Stone Home is a finalist for the Maya Angelou Book Prize and is currently longlisted for the Joyce Carol Oates Award. And If You Leave Me, published in 2018, was named Best Book of 2018 by over a dozen publications that include The Washington Post, Literary Hub, and more. She's the recipient of the 2022 National Book Foundation's 5 Under 35 Award and the winner of 2017 Penn / Robert J. Dow Short Story Prize for Emerging Writers. She currently lives in Brooklyn, New York, with her family. And Crystal Hanakim will also be a presenting author at the Tucson Festival of Books, which takes place at the University of Arizona on March 15th and 16th. And she'll be on the following author panels: Contentious Politics and Social Change on March 15th at 11:30, and Love, Loss, and Second Chances on Sunday, March 16th at 1 o'clock. Both of her books are available in our library catalog. So, welcome, Crystal. So, I'm very excited to talk with you about your books, especially The Stone Home, and also about your writing process. You've
Thank
published,
you.
you're welcome, thank you. And so, both of your novels were set in Korea and take the points of view of characters who are affected by historically significant events. You have female protagonists who play a significant role in each of the stories as well. So I just wanted to also say I found it interesting to read The Stone Home and learn that in real life there were reformatory schools that were intended to like clear vagrants off the
Mhm.
street, especially in advance of the 1988 Seoul Summer Olympics, which wasn't even that long ago. But because I'm also a Korean American adoptee, um, I had learned that the South Korean government also was complicit with what was considered the export of Korean children and babies who were being adopted out by agencies and labeled as orphans when they technically weren't. So, based on the fact that you did a lot of historical context, what was the research process like for your novels, and how did you decide which points of view to include?
Thank you for that introduction. It's always exciting for me to talk to a fellow Korean American, a fellow, book lover. For the Stone Home, as you said, it was based on these real life institutions that were in place in the 1980s, so very, recently in our past. And the South Korean government at that time which was really a dictatorship, had secretly sanctioned the police to quote unquote clean up the streets, right? Because they were trying to win the bid for the 1988 Olympics. So I first read and learned about this in 2016 through an Associated Press expose. Before then, I believe in Korea, there had been protests by survivors. There had been some murmurings, but had not been a full kind of news coverage of it because there was a lot of denial on the government's part. And I just there were some accompanying images that came with the Associated Press article, and I could not get those out of my head. I kept thinking about the children who had been taken off the streets. Some of them had been houseless, but some of them had just been separated from their families. And I kept wondering what happened to the children, right? And how could the Korean government uh, how could they have done this to themselves, to their own citizens, when only 40 years prior, similar institutions had been created by the Japanese colonizers. So I started looking into it really from that kind of place of questioning. And when I was in Korea in 2018 visiting some family, I was able to connect with a survivor who is now one of the like loudest political activists. He survived one of the largest reformatories called the Brothers Home. That was the one that was in the news a lot. And I met with him. He was living outside of the Seoul National Assembly. He had created a makeshift hut out of plank wood and tarp, and he had these very big posters up of images of all the kind of newspaper accolades the brothers' home had gotten, and then another poster with all of the photos from behind the scenes of what was actually happening, you know. So I spoke to him all day. My aunt came with me to kind of be like a cultural translator. And after that, I did a lot of research that kind of was roundabout, to be honest. I read about other institutions in other countries and other time periods. You know, for example, I read Follow the Rabbit Proof Fence. It's an old book by an indigenous person in Australia who had been taken into a reformatory center years ago. I also read Man's Search for Meaning by the Austrian psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, who he wrote that after surviving the Nazi concentration camps. So I did research by trying to get into the mind and the physical body of others that had written memoirs of their time in similar institutions.
That's interesting. And I also remember the Rabbit Proof Fence was made into a movie, I believe.
Oh,
Um,
okay. I haven't seen it. Um, I'm always worried when I read something that if I watch the movie, it'll not be as good as a reading experience,
it,
you know?
it usually isn't,
Yeah.
but that's interesting because I hadn't been aware that there was a book beforehand as well.
Hmm.
Did you write your characters in the Stone Home from specific or based on specific folks that you had read about or maybe even had met, or were they an amalgam of different folks put together?
Yeah, they were more of an amalgam. You know, I'm a fiction writer. I'm not a journalist, and so I knew that I wanted to fictionalize the story. I knew that I wanted to create a reformatory of my own. I thought that was the most respectful way to do it because I didn't want to take away the voices of the activists in Korea who are, you know, still kind of fighting for acknowledgement and reparations. So I wanted to do create my own version of it, and so I thought an amalgam would be great, you know, a good approach. And initially, I started the novel with these two brothers. And the final version, there are, you know, two main narrators, Unju, a 15-year-old girl, and Sangchar, a 16-year-old boy. I initially started with Sangchar and his story of how he and his brother were taken because that was inspired by my conversation with the activist Han Jong-san and the research that I had done. But as you mentioned in your introduction, I really love writing about women and the particular struggles and oppressions that women face everywhere, but also in Korea. So I came to Unju, the real heart, I think, of the story in a roundabout way. I and so I used what I learned about people who had been forced into these reformatories, but then I made the characters my own because I think fiction is the most interesting when we are rooting for characters, right? When we care about them, when they feel like real to us. And so it's always important to me to make characters that are very lively on the page.
Interesting. And that segued into my next question because I did notice that in both books, especially the Stone Home 2, you also have the voices represented from Songchul, but also there are multiple women in the stone home that are, including birthing, that have this generational aspect to them. And that's an interesting perspective to me as well, because you can feel how each generation is trying to survive and protect, and they do seem to approach it differently. The
Mm-hmm.
youngest generation trying to be the most rebellious. So I don't know if that was intentional as well, but that was really interesting to read.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think, um, with my first novel, If You Leave Me, it was a tighter cast of characters. And it was also very much revolving around this young girl, Hemi, and these two men or boys that she's interested in, and her, Hemi as a mother. So with my second novel, I wanted to try flex different creative muscles, right? And I wanted to capture what would it feel like to create community even within a really difficult, oppressive situation like living in one of these institutions. And so it was really important to me to have a collective of women who are not all going to get along all the time, but they have to, in the end, rely on each other. Right. And I wanted to kind of explore the different ways that women um, in these institutions will seek safety and how that can differ across the generations. Like you're saying, I think the younger generations in the stone home are perhaps braver because they're probably more impulsive and naive. But I wanted to play with that. So I wanted to play with mother-daughter, a mother-daughter story. And the main character, goes into the reformatory with her mom, but also friendship and also how you relate to elders in the institution as well.
Interesting. Yeah. Um, it also is interesting to consider how, even when there were tense moments between the female characters, that they did want to support and protect each other ultimately. Um, I also was curious about the uh, factor of food and meals. So I
Mm,
I don't know if I'm just myself food obsessed, but I'm always interested in how authors have food and meals play a part in the story or the narrative, and the particular descriptions of the meals, or how they might be symbolic in a lot of ways. Even in the modern set chapters in 2011 between Unju and Nare, the um, and I'm hoping I'm saying this correctly, the chamway melon. Um,
yes, Chana, yes.
yes, came up a lot. And
Mm,
because I have a less connected to my Korean cultural roots, was there a symbolic reason for the melon to
mm.
play a part throughout, or any of the other meals or foods, even the like Apollo sweets. How did those factor into the story?
Yeah, it's so funny because people are always remarked on the food in both my novels, and I don't think I did it purposefully, on a craft level. I don't think I purposefully wanted to devote a lot of pages to food, but it is naturally or instinctively the way that I show care. I think growing up in a Korean family, and growing up, with family that they weren't well off, right, in Korea. And my grandmother had to flee during the Korean War. I think hunger was a mainstay in my elders' lives. And so now, um, the way that they show their care is always asking, have you eaten? And the way that they show their care is just forcing you to eat all the time. So food is just another mode of communication, I think, in my life. And so that translates to the food in the novels. And I also think for the characters in the Stone Home, where they are deprived of so much, the moments when they are able to relish food is really kind of revelatory for them, right? It can feel really luxurious just to have like one bowl of miyeokguk with some meat in it. So I wanted to really linger on those moments because the book the Sondheim is difficult subject matter. And I know it won't be everyone's cup of tea, but I also do want it to be a moving story. I want it to be compelling. I want it to emotionally resonate with readers. And I always say that it's through art that we can make people care about history. And that means that I need to do my job of storytelling, right? And creating memorable moments and creating connections through time from the reader to from the characters to the readers. And I think food is such a great way to do that because we all like everybody loves to eat, right? And um flavor, that feeling of nourishment that we get, I think if I can put that on the page, I can make that connection with the reader.
So interesting. I lived in Gwangju for 1 year in 2007 to teach English, and it did seem that the kids that I taught would stick food in my face as well and want me to take a bite. The school secretary had a communal bowl of soup that she wanted me to drink from it. And every time you would go out to eat with others, if they're every bowl of banchan was replaced immediately as soon as it was empty. So it was always so much food, too much.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you feel like you have to eat it all. But and I'm also aware from friends who are of different Asian ethnicities that food is a love language. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Asian parents aren't very demonstrative in
Yeah,
expressions of affection. So
yeah.
food or maybe gifts. And then also food is a gift often when you do a business transaction, it seems like.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
yeah,
It
that's
is
interesting.
definitely a love language. And I think um, I didn't realize how fully it was a love language for me until I put it into my novels. But that's definitely a way that I show care and I'm trying to show love, for the characters and for the reader.
Oh
Mhm.
yeah. And then maybe that was how some of the women were able to bridge caring for the boys, even though they couldn't directly interact as much. Um,
Yes.
but yeah, there were some great details, even the descriptions of oil and fat on a
Mm,
soup or a grain of rice that is still taken up to have nourishment, even if it's just a
hmm.
single grain of rice.
Thank
Um,
you.
how did you decide on the name of your fictional reformatory school? I know the stone wall plays some significance. Did you grapple with what you wanted to call it?
I did. Titles are so difficult. And I knew that I wanted it to be a place. I knew that I wanted it to have this juxtaposition of the word home with something a little colder, because what I thought was really striking when I read about the real life institutions, the brothers' home, is that it was called home when it was really such a cold, difficult place, right? An abusive place. So I knew that I wanted something with home in the title, and I thought Stone Home struck that balance of something cold and imposing with something that sounds deceptively warm. Uh, but titles are so hard. I find them difficult.
It's interesting. It makes sense though. I didn't actually
Mm.
think about the fact that home does evoke something comforting, but
Hmm.
they are definitely not very homey, are they? Um,
Yeah.
and so, in terms of the political aspect, I know you mentioned in The Observer that there are political aspects of the novel, and that this isn't a singular event. You've already referenced the rabbit-proof fence, um, and it's happened to Indigenous children in this country and Canada, and to Black Americans. It does seem like we are starting to hear more about these hidden aspects of history through fictionalized accounts. I think there's a book called Stealing by Margaret Verble about the boarding schools, I think in the 50s, for Indigenous children, and The Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead. That was a fictionalized school based on a school in Florida that was also
Mhm.
abusive. And I think in the last decade only was discovered to also be a place where there were mass graves.
Mhm.
And so I wonder how many children have disappeared. Have they been able to do any kind of study to know how many missing children were never recovered?
In Korea,
Yeah.
I don't think that they've done I don't think they know the answer because I think that for decades, when someone began investigating these reformatory institutions, the government shut it down. And it was only really after the expose in 2016 that the government was forced to kind of reckon with it. And the Truth and Reconciliation Committee did acknowledge finally that the government had was culpable or involved. They did acknowledge it earlier in 2024, but I don't think that there have been investigations into how many. There were mass graves. There were a lot of abuses, and the surviving members are still talking about it, right? And asking for reparations. But I don't think there's been a collective effort, as at least from as far as I know, to figure out how many people were impacted. But you mentioned that other interview that I did, and well, that was one of the other reasons why I wanted to write this book because I knew that these reformatories were not exclusive to Korea, right? That there are these kind of centers for Indigenous Australians and First Nations children in Canada, for single pregnant women in Ireland, uh, for Black Americans in the South here in our country. And something that I kept thinking about was, why does this keep happening again and again? How do we not learn from our history? And what is the human impulse to try to reform or kind of oppress innocents, especially children? So the way that I the way that I write and the way that I think, I start with a question that is specific to Korea, but also can be kind of part of a wider lens, a more universal
Right.
lens. And so that was a big reason for why I decided to write the book. Yeah.
And that I know there'd been debate on maybe social media places like Book Talk or other places where some people were saying books shouldn't be political, and others saying how can books not be political sometimes, especially with specific subjects. Fiction can definitely be political and raise some questions and curiosity. So
Hmm.
I find that interesting that that still continues to be a debate today. Have any of the Korean press ever reached out to you to talk about your book, or have any Korean press covered or mentioned your book or books?
Yeah, there has been. Yonhap News reached out and we did an interview. It hasn't gotten a lot of press over there, but the novel is going to be translated into Korean. And it should be coming out, I think, this year or next year. So I hope that when that happens, perhaps there'll be more coverage of the book and also of the historical facts behind the book.
That'll be interesting to follow along with. Have
Yeah.
you been contacted by additional former reformatory survivors or their family?
No, it was hard for me to even find contact information for Mr. Han Jong-san. Um, I think perhaps because of the language barrier, that I have kept in touch with Han Jong-san and I sent him a copy of the book, but until it's translated, I don't think he could read it. But I have not been in touch with anyone else, but I've been reading about the news and keeping up with the news from afar.
That's interesting. I think in another interview, you've also mentioned um, your your family and your grandmother, and I was just curious if they also have had been able to read
Mm,
your books and had thoughts or um, some revelations after reading them.
mm. So, I was born here. My parents immigrated here in the 80s, and they speak English, but not well enough to read a whole novel. So when my first book was out, they really, really wanted it to be translated into Korean. And because that was the only way they could be able to read it. And I'm happy to say that both novels are going to be translated into Korean now. The Stone Home first, hopefully this year, next year, and then If You Leave Me will be after that. So I think once that happens, then the elders in my family will be able to read it. But as of yet, it's just too difficult for them to read the English.
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't actually considered how the process of getting books translated um, when their context is in that particular country, how that
Mhm.
works, and if there are many barriers to that. That's interesting. Um, I noticed that the Stone Home's writing style versus the Tone in If You Leave Me. The Stone Home is much more raw. There are uh, sentences that contain a little more like punchiness to them. Some short chapters where it feels raw emotionally. And I was wondering if that was intentional as well. There's such a visceral, and I think you said earlier, a little bit difficult sometimes to read, very painful um, scenes in some cases. But how did you decide to change the tone or the writing style?
Thank you for that. I love talking about language. If You Leave Me, I wrote that in grad school, and it was inspired by family stories of surviving the Korean War, but the center of it is a love triangle. So I felt that I could lean into sensory descriptions and make it poetic, but it didn't have to be raw necessarily, because it was really about this love triangle and about motherhood and the choices that people are perhaps forced to make because of just circumstance. And then with the Stone Home, from book to book, personally as a writer, I want to try different skills. So I knew that I wanted a different tone. I knew, like I referenced before, I wanted a larger cast of characters. I knew that I wanted a shorter amount of time just to play with some different skills for me. But also because of the subject matter, I wanted to make the language really poetic and raw to capture what it would feel like to be in one of these institutions and to feel like what would it to kind of replicate what it would feel like to try to escape, right? To try to find a way to survive and leave. And I also knew that I wanted to do short chapters because I wanted to keep the reader engaged and I wanted to keep the reader turning the pages because I think it's really easy for readers to kind of grab lighter fare at this moment, right? There's a lot of other types of books out there, like romantasy and romantic comedies and stuff. And my book is doesn't have any of that. So I'm trying to think, how can I keep the reader engaged? And to me, it's through these characters and their friendships and their, love for their sibling and their mother, but also through the language, like interesting poetic language and short chapters. And I hope that would kind of create the tempo and rawness of being inside this institution.
Interesting. It did feel at times kind of like in a TV show where a scene ends sort of abruptly and there's a blackout after you've just uncovered a character's um, deepest, rawest thoughts. Sort of
Hmm.
like, oh, okay. So that is interesting that you say that about the tempo. I have heard that second books can also be uniquely challenging because the publisher has certain expectations, and I didn't know if that changed your writing process as
Mm.
well.
Um, I think second books are hard independent of the publisher just because the first book is so special because at least for me, I was writing it in grad school and I had no idea if anyone would ever read it. I didn't have an agent, I didn't have a contract or anything. So you're kind of protected, right, from the businessy aspect of publishing. Uh, and then with the second book, I didn't sell it beforehand, but I knew more about the world of publishing. So, sometimes those voices can get into your head. But so I think that made it take a little longer. Also, COVID, and I had two babies. But
Wow, busy.
yes. But I was very lucky in that my publishers did not pressure me to write any sort of book or pressure me in the shape of the book. I was also really particular in not selling the book until I was done with it because I am the kind of writer that likes to have control over the whole process. So I wanted to finish the book and then show it to the publishers because this story was really important to me and I didn't want it to be changed by others.
Interesting. I didn't um I didn't know if authors typically have that power. Um, I think media always shows us that authors are working on a handful of chapters and have to get them submitted by a certain date or else, and then they're fretting over like the next chapter. That's really
Right.
interesting. Do
Yeah, well, some
you?
people do sell their books on proposal, and if you do that, you're selling it, based on an idea and a couple of chapters. And if you do it that way, you might have deadlines and you might have the editor kind of whispering into your ear how it should change. But the other option is to wait until you're all done and then try to sell it. So
That
that's what
sounds
I did.
that sounds like the better option. Yeah.
For me, it
Um,
is.
do you have a particular way that you set out your day to write or a routine to your writing?
It depends because I'm often teaching, but what institution I'm teaching for often changes. So my day to day looks different, but my goal is to try to write every day for at least a little bit because I like to stay immersed in the world. And then I will also, of course, have to do my teaching duties, my reading for coursework, reading my students' work. But I like to try to open the manuscript that I'm working on every day to try to keep keep a level of my consciousness alive in the manuscript. And then I do a lot of reading as well. So I read pretty strategically to figure out a theme that I'm trying to explore in my own writing, or perhaps a structure that I'm interested in exploring in my new book. So I'm constantly reading a lot as well.
So, I had another chain of thought I just lost. So because your characters in both books have really been trauma affected, um, how do you practice self-care, or do you have to put some sort of mental barrier in between writing through their lens and doing something else?
Mm, this is a really good question that I've gotten a couple of times after writing this book, and I never have a good answer for it. Um, I think when I was writing The Stone Home, it took years. It took a long time, and I think that's because it was based on a traumatic event in Korean history. So it took a long time. And during that time, I did have two children. I became a mother. So I think that was one way that I was forced to kind of slow down. I think having children really kind of, for me, made me like very wondrous about the world, right? It was really a moving and kind of eye-opening experience to kind of see the world through this little infant's eyes as he is trying to figure out how to be a person. So I think that was a way that made me slow down, made me focus on the little moments. But I also think it was a hard book to kind of be in all the time because I was trying to work on it every day for 7 years. And I think that now that I'm working on something new that is not set in a kind of traumatic period of history, I do feel lighter when I'm writing, and I do feel a little like a weight has lifted. So I think that I wasn't fully conscious of it while writing the Stone Home, but I do think the fact that it was difficult subject matter did impact me in a way.
Interesting. And since motherhood factors in both novels, did you change how you wrote um, from the lens of a mother in the Stone Home?
Mm. Yeah, I've always been so interested in mother-daughter stories, because now I am both. But when I was writing If You Leave Me, I was just a daughter. And so the I was really interested in exploring motherhood and daughterhood from both perspectives in that book, right? But I hadn't yet become a mother. With the Stone Home, there is a very key birth scene. And I will say that was like directly influenced by my experience because
So
I
it was
thought,
very visceral as well. Yeah.
yes, yes. I think labor is really, really cool. I think it's like so fascinating, so powerful, and not really written about that much in that lens. I think that we're often kind of told that it's painful and medical and something to just get through. But I thought the act of labor and delivery was really amazing and empowering and scary and transformative. So I wanted to kind of capture all of that in the book. And I do think now that I am a mother, I was interested in exploring even further that relationship of a daughter who doesn't fully understand her mother's motivations and her mother's outlook, and while also kind of showing the reader how the mother is trying to protect her child. So I do think that influenced the relationship between Unju, my main character, and her mother in the book.
Hmm. Do you think you'll continue to write historical perspectives?
I don't know. I actually think that I've always thought that I have been writing my way to the present. So If You Leave Me was set in the 1950s in the Korean War, and then The Stone Home is set in 1980s in Korea. And the third book that I'm working on currently is set in the 2000s here in New York, in America. And it is set around Korean Americans, but it's a little closer to the present. So I would say it's contemporary, although 2009, is that still considered contemporary? I'm not sure.
I don't know. I've read about how we tend to jump years so that we'll say, oh, that was 10 years ago. in the 2000s, but it's like, no, it's not.
Yeah.
Somehow we've misjudged how much time has passed based on
Yes.
so many um, things happening
Hmm.
in the 2000s. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. So I mean, I hope to be writing for a long time, who knows? But I do think that I'm writing towards the present and that I will now be writing about Korean Americans because that is closer to my experience and that there's are so many different kind of themes to explore there about this hyphenated identity that I want to be writing about. But I felt that I needed to kind of create a foundation for myself and I needed to write through history to get myself to a more contemporary American setting.
That's very interesting. And I appreciate it because I don't have a lot of context since I was born in Seoul, but I was brought to America when I was a baby. So I don't know a lot about my own history. Um, but I did also want to touch upon Korean Americanness and what it means to be Asian and Asian American. I had read your article in Harper's Bazaar about your freckles
Hmm.
and Korean women's standards of beauty, which I observed that year I lived in Gwangju, and I was shocked at how many whitening lotions there were available in the stores, and I didn't know that was a thing for Koreans especially. And so I became hyper aware. The teachers I worked with seemed to care less, but it seemed as though there were like differences between certain types of women and their professions. Um,
Mm.
but I did notice that women went to the gym very glam. So I was just curious what your thoughts were about South Korea and Impossible Standards of Beauty. There's a book by Elise Shu called Flawless that's actually about the entire South Korean beauty industry, including plastic surgeries. And I think Frances Cha wrote If I Had Your Face, a fictional story about the women who have um, crazy amounts of plastic surgery. So, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think it's so interesting to be, I was born here, but I would go to Korea a lot because my mother's side of the family all lives there. So to the contrast between the beauty standards here and the beauty standards in Korea were so different. And it was interesting to be straddling that line. And it's those kind of questions that I want to be writing about in future books because I think there's such a richness to trying to figure out like what is Korean American identity? What is Asian American identity? How is that its own thing separate from those who are not of the diaspora, right? And uh, I remember in America or like here when growing up in New York, people would always remark like, "Oh, I love your freckles." It would be a point of cuteness when I was little. And then when I went to Korea, everyone would be aghast and they would just always be so worried about my face and what to do about my freckles because they really prioritize paleness there. And so as a young girl, learning about beauty and standards and how to fit in, especially I think growing up in the 90s, it was really, I would say, pretty toxic and intense, the beauty standards. So I don't have a, nice, clean answer, but I think it's really interesting how much pressure there is both in America and Korea, but in quite different ways, especially when I was younger. Although I guess, I would hate to be growing up now with the exposure of social media and all of those impossible standards. So I don't think it's gotten easier at all. But I just am
K-pop
reflecting on
mostly.
my, yes, yeah. I'm just reflecting on my own experience and how confusing it was to have a certain set of expectations here of how to look and to be kind of made to feel foreign here because I'm Asian. But then when I was in Korea, made to feel foreign because I was too American, because I had freckles and I was tan and I didn't follow their standards of beauty.
I get that as well. I don't think people knew what Asian, quote unquote, Asian to label me as in
Mm-hmm.
any of the Asian countries I was in. They're like, you're not one of us, but we don't know what you are.
Right.
I always think too, when I was younger, being tan is such an American beauty standard, and being pale everywhere else is the mark of, oh, you must protect your skin at all costs. And if you go to the beach, you must be covered from head to toe. So
Mm-hmm.
it is interesting. Um, are you looking forward to anything in particular at the Tucson Festival of Books, or maybe what are you looking forward to the most when you come?
Oh, I'm really excited. I've been to Tucson once before for the Festival of Books in 2019.
Mm.
So I'm just excited to return. I remember having so much fun at the festival and meeting book club readers and just really enjoying the landscape because it's so, different to me than Brooklyn, where I am, where it's very, very cold right now.
Yes, and it might be very hot here by then because we're already
Oh, I'm
almost 80.
excited. Yay.
So,
I love heat. I love dry heat. So I'm excited for that. And I'm excited to meet readers and people who love books and to just be surrounded by other writers too.
oh, that's awesome. Are you, and maybe you've been too busy being a mom and working on your next book, but have you had time to read, or are you into any authors at the moment?
Yeah, I would love to plug a book that's coming out in 2026. Is that too far away? Um,
Um, I'm I'm okay with that.
yeah. Her name is Kay Kim, and I don't know her, but her editor sent me her debut novel. It's called The Future Perfect, and it's a really beautiful, poetic debut novel about being Korean and American and straddling both cultures. And it's a very intense mother-daughter narrative, which I really loved. And then I also loved, do you know Jinwoo Chung? He wrote Flux, but he has a new novel coming out, I think next month, called I Leave It Up to You. And it's a kind of like almost a romantic comedy, a gay romantic comedy, but it's also just like really beautiful and heartwarming. So I would recommend those two novels.
Um, we can link to the one that's already out in our blog post as well.
Amazing.
Um, I don't have any other questions. I want to be mindful of your time. Um, I really appreciate your spending time to share about yourself and your writing process and what went into producing the books. I'm always super impressed with writers because it seems when I was in grad school, just producing some papers seem like such a feat of effort. So I love that you've already had two pretty one a very epic saga, but major novels under your belt, and you're working on your third. And so I look forward to seeing you at the Tucson Festival of Books. And thank you so much for sharing with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Nikki. I really appreciate it. It was so fun.
Yay.